In today's video, we're going to carry on the Glasgow rebranding case study, but in this video, we're going to be looking at the role of the players, and later on, we're going to look at the success of the rebranding in terms of perception and other factors. This is for OCR A-Level Geography Spec, and first of all, we're going to focus on players. So in terms of players, the Glasgow Miles Better campaign in 1983 that kicked off the rebranding, there were two really important players. The Lord Provost Michael Kelly, he was essentially the person on the Glasgow City Council that got behind the campaign and promoted it, and this was helped by Struthers Advertising. They were a marketing company that decided to use the Mr. Happy logo from the children's book series and the slogan to create this new image of Glasgow. So together they did a very good job of promoting Glasgow as being a better place by just simply giving it a nice slogan and a good logo. It had some success, and the fact is that actually did change people's perception of it, that people did think that Glasgow was actually better. It was a marketing campaign. It was very cheap to do, 150,000, and it used the actual infrastructure, the museums that were already there, so they didn't have to build a lot of money. However, you could argue that even though it did lead on to other events like the European Capital of Culture in 1990, at the time, it didn't actually change anything for the people that much. It said that it was better, but it didn't change the infrastructure or do anything to improve deprivation. So it was a tool to kickstart things and lead on to other events rather than something that actually did physical change. So here we see the idea of an idea changing perception rather than physical change. You could argue that it's very influential in the fact if he didn't have this campaign, none of the other stuff would have happened later. So there's good stuff we can evaluate here in terms of the influence of players. In terms of physical change, really important players are government agencies. They actually can have the finance to build projects, and in doing that they can often promote the kind of cultural side of Glasgow, which is the cultural-led rebranding that it went for. We can see the concert hall at the top there, the Burrell collection in the bottom right, and part of the SEC, the Armadillo there. These were all funded by government agencies. The Scottish Enterprise was a big influence. They are part of the Scottish government. They're like an agency of it, and they actually provided funding for all of these projects, these flagship projects, at various times during the regeneration of Glasgow. And the local council, Glasgow Council, actually had impact as well. They came up with a plan, and therefore they can actually give planning permission for these projects. But they also can provide funding. Not the same kind of funding that Scottish Enterprise, but they still offer funds. And it's normally a combination of these two working together that actually gets these projects done. And we can see this in the building of the SEC Centre back in the 80s. Scottish Enterprise provided a third of the kind of construction cost, and Glasgow City Council about a sixth of the cost. So it shows you that it often takes lots of big government agencies to provide the money, but also the kind of the cooperation between groups. And another example of that cooperation between groups is the Clyde waterfront. This is a 13-mile stretch along the Clyde, which has been a joint project between the City Council, Scottish Enterprise and the national government over a number of years. And they invested £5 billion in there. Some of that money came from private players, but it was regeneration projects and multiple flagship projects, including things like the Clyde Arch, which we've talked about before, and the Riverside Museum. Essentially, this shows me that government players can be really influential because they not only have the funds to be able to do these schemes, but they also have the political power to actually do the physical change. And by doing the physical change and by putting in new institutions, they can provide economic change. And as we've said, lots of these projects are cultural-based issues, so the museums and concert halls, and so it can actually change the culture. Another really important thing to talk about here is it's a scale. So this can be done at a city-wide scale. That Clyde project was 13 miles long, and it's not just done over a couple of months. This is done over years. So since the 80s, there has been investment from Enterprise and City Council in doing this. One thing to be critical of is, though, to say not everyone wins from these big flagship projects, these big investments. So tourists often are big winners because many of these are cultural attractions, but some of the people who live nearby might not see their lives change that much and might even not be able to access that. And so we could say some of this rebranding is actually contested. Another player that would be important would be companies like the BBC. They bring in jobs and they can actually change the economic structure by providing new creative jobs to replace the secondary jobs that were there in the past. And because they're such an important creative company, they will actually encourage other creative companies to come to this Pacific Key area, which is where has become a new hub for the kind of digital industries in Glasgow. Other kind of players that are also important, architects can create really visually appealing buildings that actually attract people to come in. Dame Zaha Hadid was a world famous architect that made the Riverside Museum with her company, and therefore she has influence on the place because she makes a building that would get people to actually visit the city and change how people feel about the physical makeup of the city. One thing to say both about companies and architects is they can make physical change and often, but it will be very localised, not necessarily having the same impact as perhaps a government would over a whole city-wide area. We're also now going to talk about the success of the rebranding for the same spec, but we're now looking at how people's perceptions have changed, but also can we see if it's had any success over the impact over a long time. So one thing since the 80s that we can look at is that Glasgow used to have huge unemployment, nearly 20%, 16.9%, and half of the people in the city region in 1981 were economically inactive, so didn't have jobs. By 2021, unemployment rate is down to 5.3%, and nearly 70% of the people in the city have some sort of job. This shows a huge change in terms of economic output. It's not perceived as that city where it is kind of hugely derelict and poor. It's a place of economic growth. However, we have to put that in context and to say the unemployment level is still above the national average for Scotland and Great Britain. And so even though it's got better, it's not kind of as good necessarily as other places in the UK, even other post-industrial cities like Liverpool, Sheffield and Manchester. So in terms of what Glasgow is trying to do, it's trying to make itself a kind of cultural place to come and for tourists. And so it actually has done this. It's one of the top 10 most visited UK areas for international tourists. 2% of all of international tourists, if they come to the UK, will end up in Greater Glasgow, and they're spending nearly 400 million. That's about 200 million tourists a year, and in terms of total costs and multiplier effect, it can be 774 million a year to the local economy. So that's an incredibly successful amount of money, and the public perception of it internationally means it's a place that people want to come and visit. Not only in terms of tourism has it changed, but we could also say that there are other industries moving in there. Financial services have really grown, nearly 23,000 jobs in the city, which is about 5% of the city employment, which is higher than the UK average. And that's become because it's seen as an area of growth. It's got one of the fastest growing financial service sectors in the world, and this is because big projects like Barclays have set up a new campus there right on the River Clyde with that hugely deindustrialised area, which has got 2,500 jobs. So we can see that this is a place of growth and interest, especially in new sectors. However, we also kind of need to look at the things that might not have changed. This is a deprivation map in 2012, and the blue areas are the least deprived, the red areas are very deprived. We can see now that Glasgow city centre area has actually got more blue, and therefore we have got deprivation getting lower right in the city centre. However, if I look a little bit further out there, there's some areas that haven't really changed at all over the last 20-30 years. So industrial areas like Govan, and we also looked about Gorbals where they've got lots of that social housing. These are areas where we haven't seen little change, despite the fact it's right next to lots of the areas where these flagship projects have been built. So we can say that some of these projects aren't actually helping the people that live in them. Other issues A third of the children living in Glasgow are in poverty. Deprivation is still really, really rife in the city. And there's also something called the Glasgow effect, which means if you live in Glasgow, especially if you're a man, your life expectancy is lower. You're more likely to die prematurely. So for some people in Glasgow, not much has changed in the last kind of 30, 40 years. The last thing to kind of mention is we talked about Glasgow Miles Better being the successful campaign in terms of changing the perception, but they've actually had other slogans, Glasgow, Scotland with Style, and People Make Glasgow. You could argue that this is just an evolution of the campaign, or you could be really critical and says that it's constantly needing to rebrand in new ways because the original brand is kind of worn old in effect. So we can say maybe the brand over time has lost its power and therefore they're having to reinvent. And that includes the fact that in the future they've got this idea of the Glasgow City Deal, which is an economic plan to build over £1 billion of infrastructure in the next coming years to take Glasgow onto the next step.